In September of 1970, a somewhat psychedelicized drawing of Elliott Gould's face appeared on the cover of Time magazine with the words "Star for an uptight age."
You won't believe what caused Elliott Gould's epic meltdown. In 1971, he was Hollywood's hottest star. Then he snapped on set, and Warner Brothers declared him mentally unstable. Today, at 86, he's finally telling the real story. The hidden addiction, the blacklisting that wrecked his career, and the humiliating psychiatric tests he had to take just to work again. Plus, the devastating truth about why his marriage to Barbra Streisand really ended. Elliott Gould was born Elliott Goldstein on August 29, 1938, in Brooklyn, New York. His parents, Lucille and Bernard, were the children of Jewish immigrants who had escaped hardship in Eastern Europe. Life in America wasn't easy for them. Lucille sold artificial flowers to beauty shops, and Bernard worked in the garment industry as a textiles buyer. They lived in a small apartment, surrounded by families just like theirs, all trying to build something from nothing. Even before Elliott was born, his parents' marriage was troubled. Bernard had once tried to run away with another woman before marrying Lucille. That choice followed them for years, filling their home with tension. They stayed together for nearly 3 decades before finally separating. After the divorce, Bernard moved to Florida to be with the woman he had loved first. Elliott had spent his childhood caught between them, never really feeling secure. He later admitted that their inability to love each other made him emotionally distant, something that would affect his relationships for the rest of his life. His mother saw something in him. Maybe she thought performing could help him find confidence. Maybe she just wanted him to have a future, better than her own. When he was 9, she enrolled him in a song and dance school. At first, he was hesitant, unsure of himself. But the stage gave him something he had never felt at home: freedom. By 12, he was already performing at theaters and summer resorts in the Catskills, singing and tap dancing alongside other kids. Lucille pushed him further. She saved money to pay for speech lessons and encouraged him to take on local theater roles. She knew struggle all too well. Her father had abandoned her when she was just 2. Leaving her family to face one hardship after another. Maybe that was why she was so determined to make sure Elliott had every opportunity she never did. Her dreams for him were big, and she wasn't going to let anything stand in the way. Elliott Gould's big break came when he landed the lead role in I Can Get It For You Wholesale, a Broadway musical that opened in March 1962 at the Shubert Theater in New York. The story followed Harry Bogan, an ambitious businessman who climbs his way to success but ends up bringing about his own downfall. Gould played the role with a mix of charm and ruthlessness, proving he could handle complex characters. This wasn't just another job. It was the moment people started to notice him. But he wasn't the only one who stood out. The musical also introduced a young Barbra Streisand, who played Miss Marmelstein, a secretary with a show-stopping solo number. Her voice was so powerful that critics couldn't stop talking about her. During the production, Gould and Streisand started dating. A year later, they got married. Their romance only added to the buzz around the show. The musical ran for 300 performances before closing in December 1962. It wasn't a blockbuster, but it changed everything for Gould and Streisand. For him, it proved he had what it took to be a leading man. For her, it was the start of something even bigger. The show's real legacy wasn't just its music or story. It was the careers it helped launch. With Broadway behind him, Gould turned to film. His first movie role came in Quick, Let's Get Married in 1964. It was a comedy with Ginger Rogers and Ray Milland. Gould played the mute, a silent character whose humor came entirely from his expressions and movements. The film ran into trouble during production and sat on a shelf for years before finally being released in 1971. It wasn't a major success, but it gave Gould a foot in the door. His next big role came in The Night They Raided Minsky's in 1968, a film about the birth of the striptease in 1920s New York. Gould played Billy Minsky, one of the men running the burlesque theater. The movie mixed comedy with a look at changing social values. Behind the scenes, though, things weren't smooth. The first cut of the film was a disaster. Editor Ralph Rosenblum had to completely rework it, even blending black and white and color footage in a way that gave the movie a unique style. These early roles showed Gould's range. In Quick, Let's Get Married, he proved he could be funny without saying a word. In Minsky's, he stepped into a bigger role with a more layered character. These weren't major hits, but they set the stage for what came next. In 1969, Gould starred in Bob and Carol and Ted and Alice, a film that captured the changing attitudes of the late 60s. It followed two married couples experimenting with new ideas about relationships. Gould played Ted Henderson, a man trying to make sense of it all alongside his wife Alice, played by Diane Cannon. The movie struck a chord with audiences and made over $31 million, a huge success for the time. Gould's performance earned him an Academy Award nomination for Best Supporting Actor. He made Ted feel real. He wasn't just a guy caught up in a trend. He was someone struggling with what it all meant. The film's most famous moment, when all four characters climb into bed together but ultimately back out, perfectly captured the uncertainty of the era. This role not only launched Gould into stardom, but also positioned him as an actor willing to take risks with unconventional material. Elliott Gould's career took off in a way no one saw coming. When he played Captain Trapper John McIntyre in MASH, 1970, he wasn't just acting. He was stepping into a role that would define an entire era. The film was meant to be a comedy about the Korean War, but audiences saw it as something more. With the Vietnam War still raging, MASH felt like a sharp, unfiltered critique of the world around them. It struck a nerve, earning over $81 million at the box office on a tiny $3.5 million budget. It was one of the biggest hits of the year, right behind Airport and Love Story, but its impact went beyond ticket sales. It won the Oscar for Best Adapted Screenplay and changed how Hollywood looked at war films. Gould's performance was a huge part of what made MASH work. Alongside Donald Sutherland as Hawkeye Pierce, he created a character who didn't just make jokes. He pushed back against authority. Trapper John wasn't just a funny doctor. He was a symbol of rebellion, someone who mocked the system and refused to take war seriously. Younger audiences, frustrated with the way things were, saw themselves in him. Time magazine even put Gould on its cover in 1970, calling him a star for an uptight age. It wasn't just about the movies he made, it was about what he represented. The film itself broke new ground. Director Robert Altman threw out the usual Hollywood rules. Dialogue overlapped. Scenes felt messy and chaotic, just like real life. Characters spoke over each other, making the conversations feel natural. Swearing, which had been rare in big studio films, was everywhere. Nothing about it felt polished, and that was the point. The film wasn't trying to be neat. It was showing the absurdity of war in a way that hadn't been done before. For Gould, MASH was more than just a career breakthrough. It proved he was more than a comic actor. He could bring depth and sharp social commentary to a role. He got nominations for a Golden Globe and a BAFTA, cementing his place in the new Hollywood movement. Hollywood was changing, and Gould was right at the center of it. His partnership with Altman didn't stop there. A few years later, they worked together again on The Long Goodbye, 1973, a film that took the classic detective story and turned it on its head. Gould played Philip Marlowe, the private eye from Raymond Chandler's famous novels. But this wasn't the Marlowe people we're used to. Instead of a tough, no-nonsense detective, Gould's Marlowe was lost in the modern world. He was easygoing, almost too relaxed, always muttering, "It's okay with me," as if he knew nothing really was. At first, people didn't know what to make of the film. It wasn't like the old detective movies they had seen before. The pacing was slow, the story meandered, and Marlowe felt more like a man drifting through life than a hero solving a case. But over time, critics and audiences came around. Now, it's considered one of Altman's greatest films. In 2021, it was selected for preservation in the National Film Registry, a sign of how much its reputation had grown. Gould and Altman teamed up again in California Split, 1974, a film about gambling and friendship. Gould played Charlie Waters, a smooth-talking gambler who loved taking risks but avoided responsibility. He starred alongside George Segal, who played a more reserved character drawn into Charlie's reckless world. The film felt raw and unpredictable, just like the world it portrayed. Altman's signature overlapping dialogue made conversations feel real, pulling the audience into the chaos of poker tables and racetracks. The story wasn't just fiction for Gould. He later admitted he had his own struggles with gambling. That connection made his performance even more convincing. He wasn't just playing a gambler. He understood what it felt like to chase a win and avoid the consequences. These films showed what made Gould so unique. He wasn't the typical Hollywood leading man. He played characters who didn't fit into neat categories, men who were funny but also flawed, charming but unpredictable. His work with Altman helped redefine what a Hollywood movie could be. Even as his film roles changed, Gould stayed in the spotlight. Between 1976 and 1980, he hosted Saturday Night Live 6 times. That made him one of the show's first recurring hosts, long before the Five-Timers Club became a tradition. His first time hosting was on January 10, 1976, during SNL's very first season. The show was still new, still figuring out what it was, and Gould fit right in. He had the kind of energy that worked perfectly with its offbeat, unpredictable humor. He wasn't afraid to look ridiculous or dive into surreal sketches. One of his most famous moments came in February 1976, when he dressed as a giant bee and performed a musical number. It was weird, unexpected, and completely in line with SNL's rebellious spirit. During his time on the show, he worked alongside comedy legends like John Belushi, Dan Aykroyd, and Gilda Radner. His appearances kept him connected to younger audiences, even as his film career shifted. By the late 70s, he wasn't headlining blockbusters the way he had earlier in the decade, but SNL made sure people didn't forget him. Elliott Gould was one of the biggest stars in Hollywood in the early 1970s. He had back-to-back hits with M.A.S.H. and Bob and Carol and Ted and Alice, and was at the top of his game. Then everything fell apart. In 1971, he took on a new project called A Glimpse of Tiger, a film he was both producing and starring in. It had all the right pieces. The director was Anthony Harvey, who had made The Lion in Winter, and his co-star was Kim Darby from True Grit. On paper, it looked like another win, but the production barely got off the ground before it collapsed in spectacular fashion. From the very start, Gould's behavior was unpredictable. He clashed with Harvey so badly that the director temporarily walked off set. Things were even worse with Darby. She was reportedly so scared of Gould that the studio hired security guards to protect her. Then Gould started missing filming days. Just 4 days into production, Warner Brothers shut everything down. It wasn't just a failed project. It was a disaster that sent shockwaves through the industry. The consequences were immediate. Warner Brothers filed an insurance claim that labeled Gould mentally unstable, effectively blacklisting him. To make things worse, the film was later reworked into What's Up, Doc?, starring Barbra Streisand, his ex-wife. Seeing the role go to her only added to his humiliation. Years later, Gould admitted he had behaved badly and had no idea how political the film business really was. His career had gone from unstoppable to untouchable almost overnight. By 1973, Gould was desperate for a comeback. Robert Altman, who had directed him in MASH, gave him another shot with The Long Goodbye. But Hollywood still didn't trust him. Rumors about his mental health and drug use had followed him since A Glimpse of Tiger. He denied being an addict, but admitted to experimenting with marijuana and psychedelics. His real problem wasn't drugs, it was his reputation. Studios saw him as unreliable, and no one wanted to take the risk. Before he could take the role, United Artists made him go through both a physical and a psychiatric evaluation to prove he was stable enough to work. For someone who had once been a top star, it was a humiliating moment. Gould later said he didn't have a drug problem. He had a problem with reality. His struggles ran deeper than Hollywood gossip. His divorce from Streisand had left him shaken, and feelings of self-doubt pushed him into compulsive behaviors like gambling. Altman saw something in him that others didn't. He believed Gould's vulnerability made him perfect for the role of Philip Marlowe, a man out of step with the world around him. It was a risk, but it paid off. The Long Goodbye was a critical success, and for the first time in years, Gould was being taken seriously again. But even with this win, the psychiatric evaluation was a reminder of how close he had come to losing everything. For a moment, it seemed like his career was back on track. Then, it wasn't. By the late 1970s, a series of bad films sent him into another downward spiral. He starred in Matilda, a bizarre movie about a boxing kangaroo, and Whiffs, a slapstick comedy about chemical warfare. Neither movie found an audience, and critics tore them apart. Part of the problem was that Gould kept making bad choices. He turned down major roles like the lead in Straw Dogs, but said yes to projects that did nothing to help his career. Some producers still didn't trust him. One later admitted that Gould could have had a huge comeback if he had been in the right condition to work. But by 1980, Hollywood had moved on. The actor who had once been called a star for an uptight age was now taking supporting roles in low-budget films. It took years for him to rebuild his career. He eventually found steady work in television and later had a resurgence in movies like Ocean's 11. Barbra Streisand was just 19 when she walked into the audition room for I Can Get It For You Wholesale. Elliott Gould was already cast as the male lead. She was nervous, but determined. Something about her stood out the moment she stepped onto the stage. When the audition ended, she didn't hesitate. She turned to Gould, handed him her phone number, and walked away. That one moment set everything in motion. During rehearsals, they grew close. They spent hours talking, first about the show, then about everything else. Late-night phone calls turned into long walks after performances. Before they knew it, they were inseparable. By 1963, they were in a Las Vegas chapel, saying their vows. She was 21. He was 25. Their love was intense and full of promise. At first, they thrived. Gould was already making a name for himself, but Streisand was on the edge of something bigger. I Can Get It For You. Wholesale had put her on the map, But Funny Girl would change everything. Her performance as Fanny Brice made her a sensation. Suddenly, she was everywhere. The world was watching, and her career was moving at a speed neither of them had prepared for. Fame was exciting, but it also brought new challenges. Gould later described their relationship as a bath of lava. Intense, overwhelming, impossible to control. He was proud of her, but he could feel the shift. They weren't just a couple anymore. They were a public couple. Everything they did was under a microscope. Then, their son was born. On December 29, 1966, Jason Emmanuel Gould came into the world. The press called him the $1 Million Baby because Streisand had turned down a huge concert offer when she found out she was pregnant. To the world, it was another glamorous chapter in their love story. Behind the scenes, things were more complicated. Streisand later admitted that motherhood felt unreal at first. She had been so focused on her career that she had trouble imagining herself as a mother. But she loved Jason deeply. She wanted to be there for him, but she also couldn't slow down. Gould was facing his own struggles. He wanted stability, but their lives didn't allow for it. They both loved their son. They just didn't know how to balance it all. As Jason grew, the cracks in their marriage became harder to ignore. The long hours, the missed moments, the constant distance, it all started to take a toll. Gould once complained about her long workdays while Jason was in the room. Streisand never forgot it. It wasn't just what he said, it was what it meant. By 1969, they knew it was over. They separated that year and divorced in 1971. It wasn't a dramatic breakup. It was a slow realization that they were moving in different directions. Streisand's career had become something beyond what either of them expected. Gould had his own success, but he often felt like he was standing in her shadow. Years later, he put it simply, "She became more important than us." Even after their marriage ended, they stayed connected. Gould called their time together a fantastic experience, even if it was chaotic. Streisand admitted she hadn't been ready for marriage. She had been in love, but she hadn't understood what it meant to build a life with someone. Years later, while writing her memoir, she asked Gould what went wrong. His answer was simple. "We just didn't continue." There was no anger, no regret, just the truth. Elliott Gould never hid the fact that he struggled with obsessive-compulsive tendencies. Those tendencies took hold early in his life and eventually led to a gambling addiction that was anything but casual. He didn't just place bets, he placed them on both teams in a game. Winning or losing didn't matter as much as the feeling of action, the rush, the illusion of control. Beneath it all was something deeper, a lifelong insecurity, a constant need to prove himself. He always felt like he didn't quite fit. Not normal, but not completely different either. That feeling stayed with him and shaped the risks he took. Things spiraled in the late 1950s when his parents went to Florida. Without them around, he racked up debts, big ones. He even pawned his father's jewelry just to keep himself afloat. The situation got so bad that he disconnected the family phone to stop the calls from loan sharks. But even then, he found new ways to keep gambling. He ran a scam selling fake ads for a newspaper that didn't exist. It was reckless, desperate, and unsustainable. But for a while, it kept him going. By the time he made it in Hollywood, he had started facing his demons. Therapy helped. So did self-reflection. He saw how his compulsions had shaped his life. And without realizing it at first, they had shaped his acting too. That became clear when he took the role of Charlie Waters in California Split. For Gould, Playing Charlie wasn't just another job. It was something he understood on a personal level. The film followed two gamblers, Charlie and Bill, as they got caught up in the highs and lows of addiction. But for Gould, this wasn't just a story. It was familiar. It was real. Before filming started, director Robert Altman had him spend time in casinos. He wanted Gould to soak in the atmosphere, to feel the energy. But Gould didn't need a crash course. He already knew that world. He knew that gambling wasn't about winning. It was about the thrill, the chase, the feeling that the next bet might finally be the one that changes everything. Looking back, Gould has always been open about how his childhood shaped him. Growing up in Brooklyn in the 1930s, he was painfully aware of his insecurities. He feared looking foolish. He wanted to be liked, to be accepted. His mother's high expectations only made that harder. She pushed him toward perfection, and in some ways, he spent his whole life chasing it. Elliott Gould's later career has been nothing short of remarkable. His return started with Bugsy in 1991. He played Harry Greenberg, an aging mobster caught between loyalty and survival. It wasn't a flashy role, but it was layered. The film was a massive success, earning 10 Academy Award nominations and putting Gould back in the conversation. Then came American History X in 1998. He played Murray, a Jewish teacher trying to pull his student away from a dangerous path. Edward Norton stole the spotlight, but Gould's quiet presence gave the film an emotional core. He wasn't just there to fill space. He was the voice of reason in a world consumed by hate. While these dramatic roles proved his depth, friends turned him into a sitcom legend. As Jack Geller, the lovable but clueless father of Monica and Ross, he brought a perfect mix of charm and awkward humor. His one-liners were unforgettable, whether he was offering terrible financial advice or misunderstanding his own kids. The show became one of the biggest hits of all time, and Gould's role made him a favorite among a whole new generation. Even years later, fans still quote Jack Geller's most ridiculous moments. Then came another shift. In 2001, he joined Steven Soderbergh's Ocean's 11, playing Ruben Tishkoff, a flashy, old-school casino mogul. Surrounded by stars like George Clooney, Brad Pitt, and Matt Damon, Gould stood out in his own way. Ruben was both comic relief and a key part of the heist team, bringing that classic Vegas charm with every scene. The movie was a huge success, leading to 2 sequels. Once again, Gould had found a way to stay relevant without changing who he was. Even after all that, he didn't slow down. In Ray Donovan, he played Ezra Goldman, a financial advisor tangled in crime. On Grace and Frankie, he showed off his comedic timing alongside Jane Fonda and Lily Tomlin. In Dangerous Lies, a thriller from 2020, he played an elderly man whose sudden death set off a chain of suspense. No matter the role, he made an impact. Beyond acting, Gould has been open about his struggles with mental health. He's talked about feeling isolated as a child and how acting became his escape. Over the years, he has pushed for more awareness, encouraging people to treat mental health as seriously as physical health. He believes that facing struggles head-on is the key to growth, a message that has resonated with many. His career is proof that reinvention isn't about chasing trends, it's about staying true to yourself. He went from counterculture star to sitcom dad to crime drama staple, never letting one role define him. Even now, after 7 decades in Hollywood, he still finds ways to surprise audiences. Whether playing a mobster, a teacher, a clueless father, or a Vegas kingpin, Elliott Gould has always brought something special to the screen.